If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be greatly appreciated if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating. This helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. I'm your host, Andrew Pludger, and I'm a survivor of Bob Jones University. BJU is a fundamentalist college with its roots in white supremacy and is known for its culture of indoctrination, conformity, and control. Its influence extends beyond its campus, impacting Christian schooling, politics, biblical counseling, and evangelical Christianity. The school serves as a hub for churches, schools, and camps, and these institutions perpetrate its abusive teachings and practices. This show explores these areas of influence and amplifies the stories of those who have been impacted by Bob Jones University. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. Hello, listeners. On today's episode, I interview Mary Hubbard, and really, she grew up very isolated, like a lot of us who grew up in fundamentalism or high control religion. And she specifically grew up in the independent fundamental Baptist movement, and this IFB church was an offshoot church of First Baptist of Hammond. And she recalls her journey through growing up in fundamentalism, feeling out of place, going to Bob Jones, still feeling different and out of place, trying to find that belonging, conforming, trying to be a part of the system. And then in the end of her story, she discovers really why she felt so different. And it gave her peace about her feelings of being out of place. But enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to have Mary Hubbard on the show today. How are you doing today, Mary?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Of course. And for people who are not familiar, could you do a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Mary Hubbard. I work in higher education. I'm an English professor. I do instructional design. Married to a great man. My husband's name is Nathan, and we're currently living in Columbus, Ohio. So just a little background on me. I grew up in Northwest Indiana. This was in the area around like Hyles-Anderson College and First Baptist Church of Hammond. My parents had gone there for a while before I was born. So my mom actually taught at the school affiliated with FBC Hammond. Yes. So fun fact, when I was 10, I got my appendix taken out in the hospital, and Jack Hyles was in the hospital passing away at the same time. So little tie-in to Fundy fame. But anyway, so then I attended Bob Jones from 2007 to 2010. I lived in Greenville, South Carolina for about 5 years. And then I moved to Lynchburg, Virginia, which is famous for Liberty University. And so a couple of years ago, Nathan and I moved to Columbus, Ohio. And that means only 2 years of my life have been spent in a place that's not like dominated by fundamentalism or like an evangelical institution. So this is new.
Wow. Just, yeah, because if you're saying that, you're like, oh my gosh, Hyles Anderson, Bob Jones, then Liberty. Oh my God, I got a taste of a bunch of different like counts within fundamentalism. Oh my
Flavors, yeah.
gosh. Yes. Oof. Okay, and then could you remind me, what was the church you grew up in?
So I grew up in Dyer Baptist Church in Dyer, Indiana. It's kind of an offshoot of First Baptist Church of Hammond in the sense that a lot of the church members there were former members of First Baptist Hammond. A lot of people saw Dyer Baptist as kind of less legalistic version
Hmm.
of FBC Hammond on the surface, perhaps. So,
I see. So it was really considered like in the Hiles camp. Yeah, so today I finished editing the episode with Eric Skorzynski, which will be out by the time this episode premieres, and he really explains it really well about how Bob Jones has her own camp, Hiles has her own camp of different churches, and Pensacola has her own camp of these churches. But a lot of them, like again, even though it's different people, different leaders, still a lot of harmful teachings and theology. And I think what is important for people to realize, we need to understand the leaders of these movements and the institutions that create these movements, because all these different colleges are training up these people in a certain mindset and teachings and a way of handling things and perpetrating different dynamic. And we need to go back, where did this person come from? Who were they under? And once we get to that, we're like, oh, like this gets really dark. And, for example, get understanding Bob Jones University, understand Bob Jones Sr. And the institution makes a lot of sense for why the way it is. But I'm really curious about really hearing your story and your journey of growing up in the IFB and then getting to Bob Jones University. So just whatever you're comfortable sharing with, but can you really share your experiences growing up in the independent fundamental Baptist movement?
yeah, absolutely. So, growing up in Northwest Indiana, the entire area was really dominated by Hyles Anderson and the First Baptist Church. Even people that went to different churches, I would say, like, just the culture dominated everything. It was the kind of place where you'd go to Walmart and everyone was there with their huge families and their giant like culottes and flowing skirts and like denim jumpers, and like that was just the whole area. So that's really all I knew. To me, it felt pretty normal. I had just never seen anything different. So I had a very sheltered life growing up. I was an only child. I was homeschooled. I really spent all of my time either at church or at home. And I find that like people who didn't grow up that way have a really hard time wrapping their heads around just how narrow that is. If you're not at church, you're in the house, and that is all. So, Dyer Baptist Church was a little bit less strict than First Baptist Hammond, but it definitely had its own problems. For example, like at First Baptist of Hammond, women were taught that if they put on a pair of pants, they would go to hell. That was literally what was taught. My mom sat under those teachings and has told me about them. She never personally believed that, but it was like, we just don't have to talk about it. So people are also at First Baptist Hammond, they were taught that salvation couldn't come from anything but the King James Bible. So if you read another type of Bible, you weren't going to heaven. So it was a very fear-based, very high control cult. Obviously, there were a lot of sex scandals associated with FBC Hammond. Jack Hyles himself, had a kind of high profile affair. A lot of people left the church after that. His son also, there was a lot of that. So this was part of what drove my parents to Dyer Baptist as sort of an alternative. So Dyer had a culture that was like very much its own. Women, for example, they could wear pants around town. We could wear them to Walmart. We just couldn't wear them to church because some people there would be offended. It was okay to read other Bible versions, maybe in your home, but at church, you could only read the KJV. You could only talk about the KJV. So everyone pretty much watched movies from the 1950s. That was our entertainment. So I grew up on like black and white movies, and that's all. So also at Dyer, I would say the music program was a huge part of the church. It was a huge part of who we were. Everything was focused on music, all written like before the 1960s. Lots of gospel music, lots of hymns, and kind of just the highlight of everyone's week was going to church and like playing musical instruments and singing. And that was pretty much life for most of us. Large families, definitely the norm there. 8 children was like the standard at Dyer Baptist. Lots of people homeschooled. It was just a very like closed group. And I can see how like it didn't feel high control in a lot of obvious ways, but in subtle ways, like the control was there. Like everything felt innocent on the surface, but there were definitely some dark secrets lurking underneath.
The IFB kind of like it creates this very insular world where we're safe. Like you can put your guard down. You don't have to worry about all these things. You can trust us. We are men of God. We are spiritual authority. We're doing the right thing. And, and because there's also like this assumption that God is on our side, we're God's favorite because we're following all these rules. We have our King James Version Bible. We're all saved because we read the King James Bible. We have the Holy Spirit inside of us. Like we're above all these evils or bad things that the outside world is. And I remember I think, yeah, I was talking or I was being interviewed on the Indoctrination podcast with cult expert Rachel Bernstein. And she said, like, immediately, one of the most concerning things to her about the independent fundamental Baptist movement is the very first word, independent. She's like, oh, she's like, that like makes my antenna
Yes.
go up because she's like, cults are always independent. There's no one holding them accountable on the
Yes.
outside ever. And
Yes.
that is what is so horrible about this. But yeah, for your personal experiences in this environment, how do the teachings affect you?
So growing up at Dyer, I would say the number one thing for me was it was boring. It was so boring. I was so sheltered. I was so cut off from the world. I was so cut off from like ideas that I developed anorexia. I had pretty severe eating disorders, probably from about age 15 to 17. And when I look back, honestly, the main like motivation there was boredom. I realized that if I didn't eat, I didn't feel bored because hunger was just consuming all of my attention. There was nothing to do. There was nothing to think about. It was just the same thing over and over. It was listen to sermons, sing the songs, pray the prayers, and there was never anything new. And it didn't work for me. It seemed to work for everyone around me. And it didn't work for me. So I remember being so eager growing up to just start the next chapter of my life where something could finally happen. And I was always raised to just expect I would be going to Bob Jones University. My mom and my grandmother had both gone there. That was the only college I was really familiar with. So that to me, as a young person, that felt like my ticket out of this boring, kind of stifling environment.
Yeah, I relate to like the wanting to escape part because people are like, why did you go to Bob Jones University? And it's like, okay, well, I'm going to be under my parents trapped in the IFB still. And it is kind of ironic going to another high control environment to finally get out. But like for people, that's just how it sadly works out. And ooh, like I'm so sorry about your struggle with that eating disorder growing up. Yeah, that's when you said that, I don't know if you want to dig into that further or if you want to move on
Oh,
more
yeah.
or
Yeah, no, I mean, going to Dyer Baptist Church, it was almost like being stuck in like the 1950s, and there was just so much you couldn't do. We couldn't watch the movies that everyone was watching. I didn't know what rock music even sounded like. I had never been to a dance. I had never been to prom. I had never been to a party. There was just so much missing. And I would get glimpses on like TV sometimes of like what mainstream life was like. And I knew something was missing. I knew that I was missing out on a lot of life, but I just didn't have any power in that system whatsoever. Again, like you said, it's all about authority, it's all about control, and my parents were convinced that if, they had been told by authorities that public schools were dangerous, that I would be corrupted if I went to a public school. I really wasn't. They had tried Christian school. I didn't really have good experiences in the Christian schools in that area. And so it's like, well, there's nothing to do but homeschool. My parents both worked full time growing up. So when I say I was homeschooled, most of my experience was literally sitting at home, you know?
oh my God,
Yeah.
that's horrible.
Yeah. Hmm.
That's educational neglect. I mean, I think all homeschooling or most of it is educational neglect, but that's on a
Yes.
whole other level. That's just leaving you home alone with no.
Hmm.
So, like, would you do any schoolwork by yourself, or like was it just you reading books, or
So my parents ordered a curriculum from Pensacola Christian School. And so I had like video classes that I would watch from them. But, it was whatever I wanted to do. There was nobody looking into my life outside of like my parents and my church to kind of see like, is this kid okay? And like looking back, that was really scary.
okay, so you did a Becca's online
Mhm.
video program, and would your mother check up on your progress in any way, or was it just, oh, you watch those videos, you're good?
Yeah, I had always been, I started reading at an early age. I don't think anyone was really worried about my academics or my progress. And I think the assumption always was that she'll be fine. And, academically, I've managed to be okay. I've missed out on a lot of opportunities that I might have had. I'll never be the scientist or the mathematician or anything like that because I didn't have the professional, training as a young person in those areas. But I've managed to be okay academically. Is more just like the social aspect of being around other people my age that was completely missing.
Oh, yes, like that is so stifling to your development. Like that is something I've been thinking about too, about my own upbringing. It's just that major isolation. So when you were in contact with kids, it was only at the church, probably. When you went I'm assuming you went 3 times a week, probably more for certain things too.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Oh yeah. Church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Thursday prayer meeting, and then whatever outreach was happening. So
I see. And what other, were there a lot of kids in your church, or what was that like?
our youth group, I would say, had between 20 to 40 kids at any given time when I was there. Most of them came from very large families. So I was kind of an outsider there, being an only child. I didn't really fit in with that vibe. So it was even more isolating because I didn't fit into that culture.
Okay, I see. Because yeah, you had said that a lot of the families had like 8 children
Or more.
or
Mhm.
more.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow, that's crazy. And then, wow, you growing up in this, how did you deal with that loneliness? Did you tell anyone I'm lonely, or did your parents be like, "Oh, you need more socialization"? What was that like?
Yeah, I remember, having a conversation with my mom as a teenager, and I said, I saw some TV show and I saw like this teenager going over to her friend's house and like they were just hanging out at her friend's house. And like that sounds cool. Why don't I get to do that? And the answer basically was, well, back in like the 50s and the 60s, America was a safer place. And, it was normal for people to like hang out and like walk around the neighborhood. But that's just not the way our society is structured anymore. And so, that's just not realistic. You can hang out with people at church.
Yes, okay, that really does, I think, communicate their extreme fear of the outside world. And I've had conversations about people about this idea of the 1950s and 60s being this perfect, like abuse apparently never happened
No.
then, apparently. And as I talked to people, they were like, oh, yeah, it did happen. It just wasn't talked about. It wasn't talked about at all. It was
Mhm.
just pretended it did not exist. And, the IFB, they flourish when they keep people scared of the outside world. They don't want you to have that positive contact with the outside world at all. And, I heard someone recently, or someone said to me that part of the reason they think they have you do the like soul winning or the outreach to people is they want you to have those negative experiences with them rejecting you and rejecting the gospel. So you're like, oh, they are evil. They are bad, will never be accepted. But I am curious, like, what did you do soul winning growing up in outreach?
I did. So we would go out sometimes on Saturday mornings with the youth group and we would go to Gary, Indiana, and they would drop us off, two at a time on a sidewalk and we would go up and down the street. And yeah, we would like put flyers and doorknobs. We would knock on people's doors and invite them to church. And, the experience like you described, that's exactly what we had. I mean, it was very much go away. We don't want you here. A lot of people in that area, it had been very oversaturated already by Hyles Anderson students doing door to door outreach. So people were getting their doors knocked on constantly in those neighborhoods anyway. And so, yeah, it was a very negative experience. And when that's the only experience you have with people outside your community, it starts to be very believable that those people out there are scary. They're mean, they're rude, there's no love out there.
Yes. And so, is there anything else you would like to share from growing up in this church?
Yeah, I think I count myself pretty lucky that I didn't endure any of the abuse. Personally, I would say for me it was more a matter of neglect, but I know that my peers weren't so lucky. So, and I think the transition from growing up at Dyer Baptist Church to going to Bob Jones University was a really, really dangerous transition because all of a sudden I was out of that community. And I had always been taught that Christians are Christians. You know, if you're with like true believers, then you're going to be okay and you're going to fit in because we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. And when I made that transition, I realized that's not the case. This is a completely different community. It's completely foreign. Like you were saying earlier about all the different little flavors and subcategories in the IFB, I had grown up in a very specific one and it didn't translate anywhere else.
So I really would love to talk about your transition to Bob Jones University. So you have family members who had gone there and there was an expectation to go there. What was your view of Bob Jones University before you even had the experience with it?
So I grew up hearing just mostly my mom's experiences of going there as a student. And, you know, she had a lot of positive things to say. I think it had been a very different institution at that time. Not that it was a good one at all at that time, but it had changed a lot since the time she went and the time I attended. And, you know, she really wasn't aware of those changes. She just had those positive memories of, you know, being young, going on like European trips, you know, Bob Jones travel groups and doing fun things, having friends. Like, you know, it was a really positive time in her life. And that's what I expected for me. I expected to go there and have a ton of friends and do a bunch of cool things and go on cool trips and, you know, just basically start life.
And so what year did you end up attending Bob Jones University? What was your freshman year?
So I started in 2007.
All right. And then, so you graduate from homeschooling. And how was graduation from homeschooling? How did that, did you not have a graduation?
No graduation. We did have the option to travel to Pensacola, Florida to march in a graduation ceremony, but I didn't really see the need. Interestingly, yeah, so I didn't have a high school graduation. I wasn't allowed to go to my Bob Jones graduation. We'll get there in a bit. So that's two that I've missed out on.
Wow. Okay. Okay. We'll wait on that. That's, well,
Yeah.
that's a lot to unpack.
Hmm.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay. So you get there in 2007. So
Hmm.
really walk me through really the core negative experiences at Bob Jones University. So you're out of Dyer Baptist, this different area of fundamentalism, into the Bob Jones flavor of fundamentalism. What was that like for you?
So I never really had a sense of belonging growing up at church. I always felt that I didn't fit in. And I had that same sense at Bob Jones as well. And I was really disappointed. I expected to fit in there. I had high hopes. I just didn't. I didn't have a last name that anyone recognized. I didn't come from one of those well-known, you know, Bob Jones feeder churches. I was actually the only person there from Dyer Baptist Church. So yeah, I just didn't have a niche there. I wasn't familiar with BJU culture. And so making friends there was not as easy as I had anticipated. I found that people were very clustered into tiny little groups based on family connections, based on church connection, but I just didn't have a group like that. So I really tried. I wanted to be one of the spiritual kids. I wanted to be one of the in crowd, you know. I wanted to be an APC and a PC and, you know, society leader and all that stuff. And so I tried. I did all the things that seemed like they would get me sort of cred at Bob Jones. I went to Mission Prayer Band. I went on extension. You know, I did a lot of those sort of optional things that were supposed to sort of boost your standing, but I just never connected. There were a lot of times I was in Mission Prayer Band or on some sort of extension activity where no one talked to me. And I think this was a combination of a couple of things. I think I didn't have those connections going into Bob Jones, but it was also very much my upbringing. I didn't know how to connect with anyone outside of Dyer Baptist Church. I had never had to do that. Is at Dyer, like there was no making friends. It wasn't like you meet new people and you find points of connection. It's like everyone already knew each other. You were considered a friend because you went to church there, and that's all there was to it.
Yeah, and it's just that's very lonely.
Mhm.
It's like you're surrounded by so many people, but yet you still feel so alone. People that will never really get to know you on a deep level of, oh, your worth is based on your outward appearance, the things you do, going to the church, doing all these things. And then, you never learn to connect with other people. And it is so isolating. And it's it's such a struggle because I related to that feeling too at Bob Jones. Like when you said, I never feel like I belonged anywhere. That's what I've been seeing with a lot of survivors is we had that feeling of disconnection from other people. And that is also a sign of trauma, I think, too. That disconnection. And I think also like the trauma of like not having those social connections, not developing those social skills. Like it really deeply affects you. And I'm glad we're talking about it because it's something I don't hear a lot discussed from people because I know there's so many different aspects to people's stories, but it does have an impact. And I remember recently writing about it. It was like I was in a walking around Bob Jones in like a bubble, a clear bubble. I could see everyone and everything, but no one could touch me. No one could get past this bubble. And I was just trapped in this bubble, walking around, going everywhere
Yeah,
and desperately wanting to escape that.
that's exactly how I felt. Yeah. And sometimes I would just kind of look at people walking past and I would be like, there's no way I can reach this person. There's no way I can connect. I see them every day, but we'll never
Yeah.
talk. There's like
Mm.
an invisible wall.
Yeah. Yes. And it's like it's so maddening and it's just depletes your mental health
Mhm.
so much, so much. So you're at this school, you're feeling out of place, invisible, struggling to connect. Like how are you dealing with the culture and schedule and the rules of Bob Jones?
So with the rules, they never bothered me because I didn't know anything about the world. So I didn't know what I was missing. All I knew growing up was that I was missing out on friends and like being with other people, but I didn't know like beyond that. Like I didn't know how to have fun. And so I didn't know I was missing out on fun. I wasn't trying to listen to the music that I wasn't supposed to listen to. I wasn't trying to watch movies. I wasn't trying to like sneak off campus. Like I really wanted to be one of the quote unquote good kids. So yeah, the rules didn't bother me. It seemed like trouble sort of followed me around anyway, but I wasn't trying to break rules. I'm really tall, and so my skirts were always just a centimeter too short, and I was always getting, stopped for that. The dean of women would stop me on the sidewalk and like tell me to go change, little things like that. But yeah, like I wasn't upset about rules. So it's really ironic, what ended up happening to me.
Yeah, yeah, because like I remember when someone was talking to me about the rules, my issue with the rules is not the rules themselves, but it's the way the rules are enforced through this snitching culture,
Yes.
where you're so fearful that if you're not perfect, someone's going to snitch on you, and you always have that feeling of being watched. And like every single student is turned into like an informant, and it just creates this very harmful, hypervigilant, toxic culture. So when people
Yes.
say, "Oh, you shouldn't have gone to Bob Jones, you didn't want to follow all these rules," and it's like it's not really about that. It's they create this culture like Scientology does too. Scientology is known for that also.
Yes. And,
Ooh.
I should mention the spiritual evaluations. So, at Bob Jones, every semester you are asked to fill out a spiritual evaluation. So you have to rate yourself in all of these different categories. And it's from like how you manage money to whether you're cheerful to how hard you work to how many times you go to church every week. And there's a lot of categories on this list. And so you rate yourself, and then you sit down with your APC, who is another teenager or early 20s individual who's your peer, but they are put in a position of authority over you in your dorm room. And so they sit down with you and they take a pen and they re-rate you. And typically it's lower than where you rated yourself. And then they explain why they gave you those ratings. And then they show you Bible verses to back up what they're saying. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for sharing that because that is something I covered a little bit in Surviving BJU and like the cult. The two episodes that focused on the cult aspect because when I was there, they called it a Christian evaluation form, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's an evaluation of your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors. And really, it's self-confession, it's self-criticism. And then, of course, you have this other person who is just criticizing you and saying you're not enough and let's get you back in line. But yeah, the whole point of self-confession is to get their members back in line, to know their thoughts, feelings, emotions, and their behaviors, and yeah, to keep them conforming. And this is a part of thought reform. Thought reform, and like even with like brainwashing in China, like self-criticism, self-confessions, that's a big part of thought reform and how they had to. And the thing is, like if people didn't write something bad or, oh, I wasn't good enough in this area. They were like broken down until they confess and say, yes, I did this, this, and this. Like there's no option for you to be an actual good human being. It's assumed that you're evil and bad and you have to be made into this image. There's no individuality. But anyways, yeah, when I was there, I purposely did not fill out the evaluation form. It made me so angry
Mhm.
when they would give it to me. I couldn't like pin it then, but now I can back can see, oh, I'm angry because you're invading my privacy. You're trying to know my thoughts, feelings, and my actions, and you don't own that. They don't own that. It just felt very invasive, and I was just like, no fucking way am I like filling this out. No. And they would ask me about it every once in a while, and I'm just kind of brush it off, and I'm just like, leave me alone. When I was there, at least, they would say, you're not required to do this, but we highly encourage you. And your discipleship group leader would ask you about it. And they would happily offer to be your mentor for it to grade you. Oh my God, the people that they get in these spiritual, like they're so excited to evaluate you and make you feel so less than. But
Of course.
anyways, enough for my tangent. But anything else you want to speak to the evaluation form?
I just remember one night, I actually came out of my dorm room. I think I was going to the bathroom or something, and I found it was a PC handbook for students that were in spiritual authority. And of course, I started thumbing through and looking at it. I never was allowed to be an APC or a PC. Can't really figure out why, because I didn't break any like significant rules. But, anyway, so I was very curious about what was in this handbook. And I just remember this one section, and it was, what happens if a guy and a girl, of course, that was all they acknowledged. They didn't even acknowledge the possibility of any other type of relationship. But what happens if a guy and a girl, kiss, have sex, make out, any of that? And the answer, and they were told very explicitly in the handbook not to share this, but the answer was it depends on who they've told. If they've told anyone, like if they've told any of their friends, then they're going to get expelled. If they haven't told anyone and they come and confess directly to Bob Jones' leadership, there might be some grace. There might be some like things might be a little softer on them. And so I just found that very interesting. It was basically like the punishment is based on how many people you've told.
I see. So they're like, if you're actually telling people, that means you're kind of proud about it, so that's bad. But if you don't tell anyone, then you're ashamed about it. And if you come and confess, then oh, okay, well then we'll, in air quotes, forgive you and we'll get you back in line. That's interesting. Okay. You have the Christian evaluation form. I'm curious, what was your major at Bob Jones?
So I was an English major. That was
Okay.
interesting.
Now, I know you had interactions with the Bergs and impacts. I don't know if you want to dig into that now, or if there are other things you want to get into before we get in that area.
Yeah, we can talk about the Bergs. I had my first exposure to Jim Berg was Christian Family Forum, I believe it was called, and just hearing him talk about how to have a good marriage and a good family and really holding himself up as an authority on those things. I was required to read some of his books for the Bible classes that I took there. So most of my time at Bob Jones, I knew him like at a distance. So I should get into sort of my dating relationship at Bob Jones because that's what led me closer to the Bergs. So, since I felt like so much of an outsider at Bob Jones, I was really attracted to others who felt like an outsider. Those were the people I looked for, those were the people I tried to connect with. And so, when I started dating someone at Bob Jones who was on staff, 9 years older than me, he had that same sense of like, I don't truly fit in. And so that's what we connected over. So, this was around the time I was graduating, 2010, with my bachelor's degree. I graduated a semester early. That's why it was like in December instead of May. So over Christmas break, after my graduation, or after at least I completed degree requirements, we kissed and we made out. And that was my first experience ever with anything like that. And it was not in Greenville, it was in Indiana. And to me, it was a big deal. Looking back, it really wasn't that significant. But, I was really stressed out about what had happened. I felt super guilty. Told one person, I told a friend. And I should have known better having read that handbook. So the friend went straight to the Dean of Women. So the staff member was fired, and I was expelled from the master's degree that I was planning to start at Bob Jones in January. So I was not allowed to march in graduation. I was not allowed to come back to campus. Friends on campus were not allowed to visit me off campus.
Wow, that is just the audacity to me to say to their students, you can't, I mean, this control is insane, but then to say to control who they can interact with outside of that campus. That's just, they don't have the right to do that. But the thing is, if it's found out, they'll be expelled. They'll get in trouble just to control. Ugh, gosh. But anyways, yeah, keep going with whatever you want to share.
So, yeah, most of my friends were not willing to take that risk to go off campus to visit me. A couple of them were, most of them weren't. So that was really isolating. I felt really lost. I didn't know what to do outside of Bob Jones. My whole life plan was to get my master's degree and like teach there or be a GA there or find some way to stay there for life. And so I didn't really know what to do. I broke up with the staff member that I'd been dating. I was just kind of alone, floating around in Greenville, looking for somewhere to belong. So Bob Jones, when I had gotten expelled, the dean of women called me in for counseling. She explained that I really should get married to this person that I had made out with. At that point, like we weren't even dating. And I was like, I don't think that's going to happen. So all I cared about was getting back to Bob Jones as a student. So that's where Jim and Pam Berg came in. So they offered to help me towards that goal. And they told me that if I attended their Bible verse memory program at First Baptist Church in Taylor's, it was called Freedom at Lasts. They told me that if I attended that and I did counseling with Mrs. Berg, that after about a year, they would look into letting me re-enroll. It was entirely in their hands. Like they had the power to say whether I could come back to Bob Jones or not. And I believed them. And so I really threw myself into this and honestly believed in what I was doing. And that was a mistake.
I was going to ask deeper about the counseling with the Bergs, or at least Pat
Yes.
Berg.
Yes. Pat Berg. So my counseling with Pat Berg was extremely invasive. She told me to keep a prayer journal each week and write down my prayer requests and my praises and like my devotions, like what I had read about in my devotions every day. And every counseling session, she would look at my journal. She also kept count of the verses I was memorizing at Freedom at Last. During my counseling sessions, we would talk about, okay, there were 10 memory verses this week. How many did you memorize? That was kind of the gist of it. So at the end of that year, so we did this for a year. At the end of that year, I went in for a counseling session and Mrs. Berg told me she couldn't sign off on me coming back to Bob Jones. And I was devastated. Like she said I hadn't been committed enough to like prayer and devotions and verse memory. And I'm like, I don't know what I did wrong. I literally did everything she told me. And it was then that I started wondering if she had ever been planning to sign off because I jumped through all the hoops and at the end it wasn't good enough. So I was pretty devastated. I didn't really know where to go or where to turn. This had been, again, my life plan. I should mention Bob Jones on my academic transcript when they kicked me out. They put a stamp, it's still on there. They put a stamp that said I was expelled for sexual misconduct. So that's very limiting as far as someone, I always wanted to be an educator. I was scared to go out and start applying for jobs with a college transcript that said I had been expelled for sexual misconduct. To me, that as an outsider looking at that, I would think there was some kind of severe like sexual assault or sexual abuse or some crime that I committed. And so I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to turn. So at this point, that staff member who I had been dating came back into my life, asked me to marry him, and we moved to Lynchburg, Virginia, because he had been offered a staff position at Liberty University. So we made this sudden transition from trying to fit in at Bob Jones to trying to fit in at Liberty. And that was a whole different type of culture shock.
Yeah, so before we get into that, I really wanted to see if you're okay with maybe sharing some of the things you learned through these Freedom That Lasts, I don't know, seminars, or like what was it? Was it his program, or was it, because one of his books is called that, isn't it? Freedom That Lasts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was almost like Awanas for adults. And it took place at First Baptist Church in Taylor's. And it was weird because it was sort of like an outreach program. And it was supposed to be like giving people freedom from addictions like drugs, alcohol, porn, like whatever. And when I would go there every week, it was like there were two sides of the room. Okay. We would have all these chairs set up in this big room. And on one side of the room were all the church people in their like denim skirts and the collared shirts. And on the other side of the room were all these people that like were on drugs, people that didn't look like us, right? People that maybe had tattoos, people that maybe had like different colors of hair, people that weren't wearing the right clothes, people that didn't fit the mold. And we sat on different sides of the room and we didn't interact with each other at all. Of course, I sat on the sort of Bob Jones church people side of that room. And before this, there would always be a sermon, and then there would be a Bible verse memory time. But before the sermon, there would always be a musical number that somebody from our side would get up and we all knew the words, and none of the other people knew the words. And it was just really awkward. It was like an attempt to put everybody together and say that we were all sort of equal and that we all like belong together. And yet the way everyone behaved, it's like those people from outside the church didn't even exist.
I see that. That is sounds like an awkward situation, and it doesn't surprise me though because fundamentalists aren't great about being loving at all. Not great about that. But yeah, what were some of the teachings of this program?
So the basic idea was that if you memorize enough scripture, you will not be addicted to whatever it is you're addicted to. Like they truly seem to believe that having people recite Bible verses was a treatment for addiction. And that was really the whole purpose of being.
And I'm curious how they why they wanted you to be a part of this. They saw you as a sex addict, like,
Mhm. I'm pretty sure that was the mentality. Like I didn't have self-control. I wasn't able to, follow their rules. And so they saw me as someone who needed the restraint that memorizing scripture was supposed to provide.
and I'm curious how much they pushed Jim Berg's books.
Quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what a
Yeah.
scam. Yeah, such a
He's very
scam.
good at marketing in a spiritual way.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh my gosh. I don't have his Freedom at Last, but maybe I'll get it and dig into it. Anyways, it's so harmful because none of these things are backed up by research. And the thing is, when no one can speak up and say, this isn't working for me, because guess what? You're the problem. You're not believing enough. You're not trusting enough. You're not praying enough. This is the answer. This is narcissism that their way is the right way and the only way, and you are the problem. And that's very common in really cults is, they assume they have the truth. And if there's a problem, you are it. You have to believe more. You have to conform more. Do this, this, and this. And when you're in that environment, you're not going to speak up. You're not going to say, and you end up blaming yourself. You end up not questioning it until you have to question it. But yeah, I'm so sorry. Just you were subjected to him and his wife, his teachings, and also just a waste of time. The waste of time of that.
Yeah.
Like, how long was that? Did you have to do that?
It was a year.
Ugh.
And it was a year of me not moving forward in my career or my life and just kind of like I worked at like a call center in Greenville and my whole like purpose for that year of my life was getting back to Bob Jones.
And so I'm curious, why did you want your life to be Bob Jones?
I've asked myself that so many times because I think the answer truly is like I was afraid to try anything else. Everything else felt foreign. I almost felt like I wanted sort of the boundaries and sort of the safe little community that Bob Jones provides. I remember when I graduated, everybody was telling me that I should move into Campus View Apartments, which is like an apartment complex that's owned by Bob Jones, is right across the street from Bob Jones. And I remember thinking, yeah, that would be perfect. I could live in Campus View Apartments. My entire life could be spent here like on this campus, looking at this campus outside of my window, and like I never have to step outside and try something new. Like I can eventually, if I stick around here long enough, I'm going to belong.
Yeah, if I meet their standards, they'll accept me and I'll be safe in this environment. And I mean, I understand that. There is, even though the toxicity, there's that sense of safety. And like you're made to be scared of the outside world, the unknown. And you're really like being a part of fundamentalism, it's such a complacent, routine, predictable life. And there's a safety and a feeling of certainty and structure to that draws in a lot of people. Oh, we'll take care of you, or oh, we'll do this. And even though Bob Jones, they still haven't taken care of a lot of people that they said they would.
Mhm.
But yeah, okay. So then you're told by Pat Berg, you don't meet our standards, you're not enough, you can't come back. And then you go, with your husband to Lynchburg, trying to fit into the Liberty crowd. What was that like?
It was really hard. So Liberty University is very different from Bob Jones, and they see themselves as vastly superior to Bob Jones, to fundamentalism. They think they are so much better, and they talk about it all the time. And when I got there, to be honest, I went there because it was like the option that I had. it was hard to get accepted to grad school programs with a Bob Jones degree. And so when Liberty accepted me, I jumped at the chance. And I saw everyone there as worldly. I was afraid of everyone there. They listened to CCM, they went to parties, they wore skinny jeans. Like these were not people that I felt at home with. And I felt like this was a period of my life that I just had to get through so I could get my degree and go back to the safety of like a more sheltered fundamentalist life. So it's interesting because now, though, like in retrospect, I am seeing that Liberty University is just as high control as Bob Jones and just as dangerous, if not more, because they're more powerful and bigger and wealthier. It's just in a very different way. So they might not be trying to control like the clothes you wear or the music you listen to, but the level of thought control at Liberty is just out of this world.
And do you want to dig into that a little bit?
Yeah. So at Liberty, any sort of like progressive thought was immediately shut down. Conservative political ideology at Liberty was more important than anything else. It was more important than religion. It was more important than academics. It was really just all about pushing conservative ideology. And I remember when I was writing my master's thesis there, I was about to graduate with my master's degree. I was writing my thesis, and I had 3 guys on my thesis committee. And the night before my thesis defense, one of them sent an email to the group and said, like, I can't be a part of this anymore. I'm off this project. And it turns out that because I was talking about some more progressive ideas in my thesis, he was uncomfortable with that. And he tried to derail my entire project. We had to find somebody overnight to be on my committee. So it was that sort of thing. It was, the people in charge at Liberty snapped their fingers. Everyone like bowed to their commands. And of course, there were, sex scandals going on at Liberty University as well.
Wow. And that is the thing that you see in these high control groups are these leaders have all these rules for other people and expectations of a lifestyle to follow, but they never follow it themselves at all. No, they do not. And so I know in your story you had wrote to me, you had mentioned something about marriage counseling. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. So there was a lot of pressure on me and my first husband to get married after what had happened. Looking back, just in retrospect, it is shocking to me that an educational institution would be telling people they need to get married or expelling graduate students for making out with someone. Like that is mind blowing. But at the time, I never even questioned it. It seemed normal. So, there was that pressure to get married. And of course, like a marriage on that basis is not going to be healthy at all. So ultimately, after 5 years, that ended in divorce. So we did attend Christian marriage counseling in Lynchburg, Virginia, and this caused even more problems. It made everything worse. One point in that we were separated from each other. We were living in different places. We were on track for divorce. And our marriage counselor told us to go home and have sex. And to me, that's just so invasive. It's so humiliating. It's so authoritarian to think that you can tell people to go have sex. Like, that's not counseling. That's not therapy.
No.
That's something completely different. So this was also like there was a lot of the love and respect rhetoric involved here. You're familiar with that. I believe his name is Emerson Eggerichs, and he wrote the book Love and Respect. And the idea is like men need respect, women need love. And so as a woman, your job is to give respect to the man. And as a man, your job is to give love. Super toxic, dehumanizes both genders, I think. Yeah, it was a train wreck.
Oh, I'm so, so sorry. Oh, gosh. And so, where did this counseling happen?
This was at, I believe, let me look up the church's name because I believe it was Timberlake Baptist Church. Blocked that one out. But we went to counseling there for at least a year. Yeah, Timberlake Baptist Church. It was a Bob Jones feeder church.
Okay. And then, is there anything else you would like to talk about your time in Lynchburg or the counseling?
Yeah. So after my divorce, I started dating my current husband, and sort of both of our religious and spiritual trauma combined. We started sorting through all that together. So Nathan had grown up in Baptist churches in Michigan. He went to First Baptist Church of Rochester growing up. And he moved to Lynchburg when his dad got a job teaching science at Liberty University. So he had been a Liberty student as well. So when we met, we were both pretty like disillusioned with fundamentalism and evangelicalism. And we were disillusioned though in like a guilty way, if that makes sense. Like we felt like it was our fault. We couldn't make it work. Like we never really questioned whether it was the right thing. We just questioned whether we would ever be able to meet the standard.
Oh, I'm so sorry. And like I was saying earlier, like you're taught to blame yourself. You're programmed to be that way. And it keeps people from holding these systems and leaders accountable. But anyways, I'll let you share what else you want to share.
Yeah. So when we met, like Nathan had already had really harmful experiences with several churches in Lynchburg. He'd been struggling with clinical depression for a few years, and he was kind of going around to different churches trying to find, a place where he fit. So at one point, he was attending Highland Heights Baptist Church. He heard sermons there about how mental health concerns are a sin. You don't need medication, you don't need therapy, you just need more faith if you're struggling with depression. So then he started attending Calvary Chapel of Lynchburg, looking for an alternative. And he opened up to some people there about his struggles. That was even worse. So it was at Calvary Chapel where Nathan was ambushed during a church service. The elders called him up to the front of the room without consent and anointed him to cure his depression.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so what was his reaction to that?
So that was where he started becoming like, I don't want to go to church anymore. Like, I'm done with evangelical and fundamentalist churches. When we started dating, though, and when we got married, we decided again to try to make church work. Like, we wanted to make it happen. We just thought we've tried all these different places and none of them were good, but I'm sure there's the right place out there, which in retrospect, that's what our parents and all the adults we knew had been doing their entire lives, right? It's just you go to a new institution, you have high hopes, you get disappointed, you get abused, you get mistreated, and then you're like, I'll go someplace else and it'll be different.
Yeah, and it's so tragic because you're taught to never question these systems, these teachings, their theology, their interpretations, their applications, and questioning these leaders. So, what really stopped that cycle for y'all?
I would say it was a combination of things. We decided to attend Blue Ridge Community Church in Lynchburg, well, in the Lynchburg area, and that was our attempt to like find kind of a kinder, gentler church. People were really nice there. They wore skinny jeans, they played the guitar, whatever. It felt really like gentle and like different from what we were used to. We joined a marriage counseling group there, actually, not counseling, but just like a marriage support group kind of thing for married couples to bond and grow community. And that really helped us start to deconstruct some things because the people that were sitting across the table from us, the people that were praying with us, the people that were reading their Bibles and singing Christian songs with us, we were seeing what they were posting on Facebook. This was around 2016. And there was so much hate. There was so much just like violent extremism. There were so many pictures of guns. There were so many like violent political cartoons. And we just realized like these are hateful people and the way they're behaving at the table across from us is not who they are.
And so, what was that process of leaving? What was that like?
So it was scary. It was hard. I think moving away from Lynchburg, Virginia has been key to that process because when you're in a city like that or a town like that that's just completely dominated by the presence of this giant institution, like you can't think for yourself. And it's very hard to sort of carve out a life for yourself apart from that giant bubble. And so moving away was huge. I think honestly, meeting people outside the IFB and sort of evangelical circles was also huge for us to just sort of move past that and heal. When you've never really gotten close to anybody outside your circle, you can only believe what you're told about them. And we believed they were dangerous. We believed people outside that Christian bubble were like full of temptation and debauchery, and they were going to like ruin our lives if we made friends with them. And like now I have a lot of friends who aren't Christian at all. And mostly we're like playing board games, going to plays, sharing like charcuterie boards. Like we're doing things that aren't ruining anyone's life. And I think this is part of why fundamentalism tries to keep its members cut off from outsiders, because when you really get to know people, you realize, oh, they're not boogeymen, they're just like regular people.
Yeah, they want to have that control, or like, because like once you have that positive interaction, it really bursts the bubble and makes you question a lot of what you've been told your entire life. But I really am curious about getting to like some of your beliefs now and how you've been healing. But I want to leave space open for any other stories you want to share from being in fundamentalism and evangelicalism.
Okay. I think just another thing I would mention is finding out that I was donor conceived has been incredibly healing. It was an important part of my process. So my biological father was a sperm donor, and when I found that out a few years ago on my own through 23andMe, it was like this huge door opened up for me. Those questions like who am I? Where did I come from? I always thought I had the answers to those questions. Like I came from Christian fundamentalism. This is who I am. But now, like, there's a question mark there. Like, who is this person? I don't really know. Like, I'm never going to get some of those answers. And it's given me so much freedom. It's given me permission where I feel like I can truly write my own story. It's also sort of so I did find out that my sperm donor is gay. And that was huge for me because before that, I had never really thought about, it just it wasn't something I thought a lot about. Homophobia wasn't something I thought one way or the other. And I always said, well, I don't really know what I believe about that, but it doesn't matter because it doesn't involve me personally. And all of a sudden, like it did involve me personally. And I had to really start questioning that internalized homophobia that I had grown up with and realize just how stupid it was.
Yeah, like I can only imagine how much it would make you question. And, was there a sense of maybe relief too? Because it's like, oh, I always felt like I never belonged here, but maybe there is somewhere else I belong with someone else who cares.
100%. Yes, it validated that feeling that I had never quite fit in. There was part of me that didn't come from this.
Yes, okay. And then for you, like, what are some of your beliefs now and how have you been healing?
So I would say my primary belief right now is organized religion is dangerous. Anyone who tries to speak about spiritual matters with authority or with any sort of certainty, I see them as manipulating others, and I don't want any part of that. I don't think religion and spirituality have any place anywhere that money and power are involved. And unfortunately, anytime you get a group of people together, power is going to be involved, And so I would say, like, to once you observe that same pattern over and over and over of like control and abuse, at some point you just cannot justify going back for more. And so that's where I am. Like, I can't be part of institutional organized religion anymore. I also would say that, growing up, I always assumed that like pleasure and enjoyment and just having fun and relaxing, those were sort of sinful distractions from what you should be doing. And I've gotten to the place where I just want to have fun. I just want to enjoy life. It's okay to do things just because they're fun. You don't always have to be working hard. You don't always have to have some sort of like grand mission. Growing up, it was always like, well, what's your mission? You're going to raise a bunch of godly kids, right? You're going to teach Christian school or do some sort of ministry. You're going to win souls for Jesus. You're going to build a spiritual legacy. You're going to get your trophies in heaven. Like there's always some sort of grand narrative that you're a part of. And now, like, I don't feel that pressure to have this calling, this mission. I'm just free to be. And to me, that's beautiful. That's where I want to be.
Oh my gosh, that is powerful because that can, even like when you leave that environment, that can kind of translate into other areas that aren't necessarily spiritual or religious. You might take that into a career you're doing and feel like your worth is only based on how much you do. That's something I'm working through in therapy now is, I feel like my worth is based on what I can do and accomplish. And if I'm not constantly doing that, I'm not worthy. And my therapist is like, don't you see how this is from your upbringing? Even though you're not religious or doing these things, you're taking it in other areas. And I'm like, ah, fine. Okay. I see you. I hear you. And that makes sense. And it's so hard to undo. It's so hard, but I'm so glad that you've gotten to the place where you're like, I don't have to be. what they want. I don't have to do this. I can just be human and enjoy life and experience that pleasure of however you want to explore or seek that. And I am curious too about how you've been able to feel that connection with other people now.
So where I am now, I'm very wary of any sort of group or institution where there's some sort of power or control going on. And so when I make friends, I tend to do it. My husband and I both tend to do it in a very like scattered way. Like we have this friend over here and this friend over here and this friend over here, and we hang out with each of them separately, but we're not trying to build sort of a friend group. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with a friend group, but just with my experiences and the way I was raised and what I've come out of, like that doesn't have a lot of appeal for me. I'm really more into like one-on-one connection. And I get a little bit like uncomfortable when any sort of like group think or like group identity starts to happen.
Yeah, and it's understandable because I think what I'm really excited about this podcast and even with the Surviving BJU is like trying to educate people on those signs of these different high control groups, or maybe red flags, and maybe a group is becoming unhealthy. And I know group think is such, it's not a lot of different groups, and it's good to be able to recognize that, I think, so you can avoid giving into peer pressure and getting involved with something you don't want to be involved with or do something you don't want to do. I've noticed that with other survivors too, is being very careful about groups is something I'm still very careful about too, people. But yeah, I'm glad you've been able to find those different friendships and being able to recognize unhealthy groups and like really protect yourself from that. But is there anything else you would like to share?
I just want to encourage anyone who might be listening. A lot of my friends who grew up in these circles, they're sort of afraid to fully step out because it feels lonely and it feels scary, especially if you're one of those people that did fit in. It's like, what am I going to do now if I step outside of this bubble or if I completely leave this all behind? And I just want to encourage everyone, like it can be done. And it is hard and it is new and different and like awkward, but you can completely rewrite your story. You don't have to sort of be chained to your past if you don't want to be.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for sharing that, Mary, and coming on the show and just sharing your journey and your growth of getting into the unknown, outside of your comfort zone, and seeking the life you truly deserve and that you really needed. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.